the keys that Helena Petrovna Blavatsky gave us, we can see the theosophy that exists all throughout our humanity. In regards to those keys, the writing of the Secret Doctrine, we have a talk today on the challenges and the opportunities of such an epic work.
Thanks, Laura. As was mentioned earlier, we in 2025 and finally available now in 2026, we published a new edition of the Secret Doctrine with some updates and such. And first, Jerry asked, maybe I could just give a little talk and just kind of run through what we've done. And the more we thought about it, the more we realized you need a little bit of history first before we can, understand why a new edition was even necessary, for starters. So I thought I would go through some of the history of the writing of the Secret Doctrine. It's a fascinating story. It's, theosophical historians, some really great researchers have pieced together a lot of the pieces of how the writing of the Secret Doctrine happened. We have all kinds of letters from Blavatsky and others and testimonies from people who were there working with her and such. So we'll go over a little bit of that. And there's way more than we can cover in a short little talk, but I'll go through and hit on some main points that we can bring in, and then that'll inform a little bit more of to what we've done now with this new edition and why. So, the first thing is actually the Secret Doctrine was an ever-changing thing. The actual writing of the Secret Doctrine started as far back as 1884, even though it wasn't published until 1888. And along that whole stretch, there was lots of changes in the direction. There was different plans of what the Secret Doctrine was supposed to be. The earliest was essentially to take Isis Unveiled and rewrite it. That was the initial idea. Now there's two books that were sort of at the forefront in the Theosophical movement at that time. One is Isis Unveiled, and the other is Esoteric Buddhism by Sinet. And with that esoteric Buddhism work, what we realized with that is that the HBB's teachers, the Mahatmas, they were working directly with Sinet, and that informed his book. So they were giving certain teachings that could come out and be public in the world. Now, there's an interesting letter from KH to Sinet where he says, around 1884, where he says, well, we're not able to give any more new teachings out. So now what's left to happen is we need to let the chelas in Adyar at that time to go to work on what you've produced and cast it into a more systematic form. The other thing that they wanted to do was correct some of the errors, because there's some mistakes that Sinet made in his perceptions. So the initial idea of the Secret Doctrine was basically, let's take Isis, which they weren't happy about. HBB wasn't happy about it. Her teachers weren't happy about it. And let's rewrite it. At the same time, let's correct some of the stuff that's in esoteric Buddhism and just present the world with a more clear, more systematic vision of these teachings. The initial idea was actually that this was going to be serialized by the printers of the Theosophist magazine in India. So they were going to just put out 70-page pamphlets, and they were going to run that for a couple of years. And the idea was probably 20 parts, which would have been about 15 or 1600 pages. The other thing off the start was that Subarro, who was a co-chela of Blavatsky's with the same master, was going to be a co-writer and co-author. And actually, Blavatsky wanted Subarro to write the majority of commentaries and such in the book, but that plan didn't work out. Around 1885, there's that initial idea of let's just rewrite Isis Unveiled got changed. And apparently that change came from Master M. Olcott writes about this, that there was a change in plan. Now that change in plan resulted in something totally different. And that change in plan also corresponded with HBB having to leave India and go to Europe. So that shuffled a lot of things up. And by the time HBB got to Europe, the plan for the Secret Doctrine had settled into this sort of 4-volume historical treatise. It was going to be volume 1 was going to be called Archaic, and then Ancient, and then Medieval, and then Modern. And it was going to walk through the teachings in a kind of historical context. Sometime around then, permission was also granted to now use the stanzas of John And that seems to have changed everything. So initially, that wasn't part of the plan. At a certain point, that becomes part of the plan. And when it becomes part of the plan, things change. So that in what I've got here is plan 3, around that time, things shift around a little bit. HBB first off writes a 600-page introductory book that she says this needs to precede the Secret Doctrine. She says, I want this book to be read first, because if people go straight to cosmogony and anthropogony and they get into all that, she says it's going to be way too metaphysical. So she wrote a book that was basically a history of the atoms. Now that became an introductory book, and what was originally called Archaic was going to be the original volume 1. That's what ended up becoming commentaries on the stanzas of John. So the Archaic becomes what we now know as cosmogenesis. So we have this shuffling of all these different ideas, and when HBB's in Europe, she's just writing like mad. We'll go over that in a minute. I want to talk a little bit about what she was doing and the incredible effort she was putting into the writing. When she was writing there, she was just pumping out stacks of manuscripts. And the idea was that there was going to be some commentaries on the stanzas of John. There was this giant introductory book that she wanted to lay out, but it was starting to get kind of muddled. There was so much written, and it wasn't very systematically organized by the time she got to London. So this is, as you can see, several years into writing the Secret Doctrine. She finally gets to London, and this is when she actually gets like really good helpers. So the helpers that show up in London, not only are they incredibly eager, they're also skilled and capable. So they're able to help her a lot. Now, the first thing that happens there is that they say, there's a funny testimony from Archibald Kitely where he says, well, she handed over to us a stack 3 feet high of manuscripts, and we went through it page by page. And then we had to go back to her and say, well, basically kind of say this is a mess and it needs to be organized somehow, and we need to come up with a plan. So it was actually the Kitleys who came up with the plan that we now have, which is that volume 1 is cosmogenesis, volume 2 is anthropogenesis. Volume 3 then was going to be that introductory book that she read. So it was their suggestion to move that later on. That was against what HBB actually wanted, because she wanted people to read that first. But that would become volume 3, and then volume 4 would be on occultism, which essentially was never written. There's letters from HBB in 1891 where she's still saying, I haven't even started on it yet. So there's that. Now, what we end up with in the actual printing is volume 1, cosmogenesis, and volume 2, anthropogenesis. And that's what we call now the Secret Doctrine. But there's a long road to get there, and that's what we've just kind of summarized a little bit here. Now, I'm going to go on. Jerry, can you go to the next slide, please? And we've got tons of information here, and I'm going to skip through some of these quickly. We've just gathered some quotes and stuff together that kind of back up some of the ideas of how the Secret Doctrine was written, the changes in plans and such. Now, there's some really interesting ones here, but for a short talk, we don't have time to go into all of them. But this talk will be recorded, put online. Once it's online, people can pause on these slides. You can have a look and read through them. So that's kind of how we'll go through it here now. On this slide, I just want to draw attention to the third quote down. Starts, we can give no further information. That's a really fascinating one. That's from KH, where he's saying we can give no further information on the subject already approached by you. That's Sinet in his Esoteric Buddhism. We have to leave the facts already communicated to be woven into a consistent and systematic philosophy by the chelas at headquarters. So that's a good example of sort of the original plan there was, well, they had already given out what they were going to give out to the world, essentially. And Sinet had put that together, but now they needed their chelas to take that and put it in a really good systematic form. So it's a really interesting idea there that the Mahatmas seem to have had a sort of limit on what they could do. They had maybe not received permission to give more, and so here we are. After that, though, then they got permission, apparently, to publish the portions of the stanzas of John that HBB used. So there's all kinds of moving targets here. These quotes are kind of interesting for that. Jerry, next. So here's just a few quotes together about what the original 4 volumes were going to be. That's the sort of historical treatise that it was going to be. We'll just leave that so people can pause on it later. Next. some quotes here on that original introductory book that she wrote, which is a really fascinating side story. I'm not going to go into detail here, but this introductory preliminary book is essentially what becomes the volume 3 that was later published by Besant and Mead, at least portions of, which is a really fascinating story. We have handwritten manuscripts of portions of that introductory preliminary book. And then some notes on the archaic volume, which became Cosmogenesis. Okay, next, Jerry. And finally, some quotes. Just this is mostly the Keatleys and how the original plan was then formulated to become the 4-volume set that what we got was the first 2 volumes of. So there's a few quotes there that are really interesting as well. But we'll just skip on through those, because what I want to really get to now, go ahead next, Jerry. It's a little bit about actually the writing of the Secret Doctrine, because it's a fascinating story, and it says a lot about what HBB, who HBB was and what she was doing. So there's 3 sort of main points. One, it was a very collaborative effort. When you dig into the history, it's fascinating how collaborative it was, how many people were involved, and how often HBB was almost begging people to help. You know, she had some trusted people around her, and she was constantly saying, can you help with this? Can you take this? Please help me rewrite this. I'm not an English speaker. Can you please do this for me? And so on and so on. So it was a very collaborative effort. She had unbelievably challenging working conditions. She was extremely sick the entire time that she was writing The Secret Doctrine. She almost died during the writing of The Secret Doctrine. And yet she was continuously working 12 to 14-hour days nonstop for years. It's actually unfathomable how much she was able to do in the conditions she was in for all of those years. And the third sort of main part is just how much editing and revision and rewriting was constantly happening. I mean, the number of complete rewrites and cuttings and pastings and notes and margins, and when you hear from the people who were working with her, it feels like it was a complete nightmare trying to put the book together. And that's a really interesting one, which we'll touch on in a little bit, because that leads into why not only ourselves now, but why people like Mead in the late 1900s, why people like Boris Dezerkov in the mid 20th century had said, well, actually, this book needs some editing, because it was a really rough process as it was being put together early on. So we'll go through a few of these things in a bit, but I just, under the last little line on this slide here, we've got this little note about the result. Now, this is essentially why we decided to produce a new edition where we do some very restrained correction and updating and fixing of references and spellings and things like that. Because the 1888 edition, when it got to the printer, because of the scrambled nature of all these revisions and edits, is in pretty rough shape for a final printed version of a book. So we'll go through that in a little bit. Jerry, let's go on to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to go through a few slides really quickly here again. The first one here is some really interesting quotes in it. This is about how the Mahatmas themselves helped HBB with the writing of the Secret Doctrine. I'm sure some of you know some of these quotes already. The second quote, that's actually a mistake in the second quote. That's not HBB to Hubschleiden. That's actually Hubschleiden himself talking about HBB. So I have an error there. But the third and fourth quotes are famous ones that I'm sure many of you have heard before, which are testimonies by KH and M to the fact that they were essentially co-authors of the Secret Doctrine with HBB. So there's some interesting quotes there people can look at later. Next. The other really fascinating part when you dig into the history is the occult method aspect of the writing of the Secret Doctrine. Now, lots of us have heard little things here and there about that and how much can we really know about it. But here's a few quotes from HBB that are really fascinating about what was going on for her. One of the things we hear a lot about is the astral light idea, looking into the astral light for information or for references and such. The second quote down is a really fascinating one in that, where apparently HBB's master had said, actually, it's too difficult for you to be doing that right now, so we're going to do something different. So that may be because of her health, who knows? But there's this other method that was happening when she wrote Isis Unveiled, and also again with The Secret Doctrine, where she says she was being shown things in kind of visions and such. There's also the third quote down where she says she just wrote for a whole stretch of time where she was just listening. Now, who or what she was listening to is not clear, but there's some really interesting ideas about these kinds of occult methods of writing that were occurring. Next year. Now, the occult methods of writing is one thing. The other thing is that there was just a lot of just regular old sitting at a desk with a pen and writing nonstop, hours and hours and hours till 1 a.m. Her regular routine was 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. nonstop writing every day with a little break for lunch. That was the day. And that went on for years. So, the condition of work, I think, when we go into it and we really look at these testimonies of people who were with her at that time and her own notes on it, is actually unbelievable what she was doing. All right, next, Jerry. Now, despite there being occult methods and there being all kinds of things, and her just sitting at her desk writing nonstop, there was a lot going on with others helping her out, and it's really fascinating to see some of the things that were occurring with all of that. So, for instance, she was with a few people that she really trusted. She said, you just do what you want to do with what I've written. She would write something, she would hand it off to somebody. I mean, she was doing this with Subaru in the beginning. She did this with the Keatleys later on, where she would say, here, take this, please. Just rewrite it if you think it's needed to be rewritten. She says here in the second quote down, I give you carte blanche. She kept saying things to the Keatleys like, make it as though it's your own. And of course, they were all nervous to do that because they're like, we don't know this stuff well enough to do that. But that's how her attitude was. Her attitude was, I've written the manuscript. You guys just do what you need to do with it next. The second to last quote is a really interesting one. This E.D. Fawcett, who was staying with her for a while, he worked with her on the second volume. And one of the things that it says here is, he suggested, corrected, and wrote. And several pages of his manuscripts were incorporated by HPB into her work. So there are portions of the second volume of The Secret Doctrine that were actually written by Fawcett, and she approved and brought them into her work. So there's all kinds of that happening during the writing period, and it's really fascinating when you get into it a bit more. Okay, next. This one is an interesting one. The Keatleys weren't satisfied with the commentaries on the stanzas. They said, hey, you've promised all these commentaries and there's barely any. Can you do more? And then she, read the bottom of the first quote there. She kind of tells them off a little bit about it. She says, why do you need this? Like, it says the stanzas are as plain as the nose on your face, so but they went through this process with her where they encouraged her to write more commentaries. And the way they did it was she got them to write questions about each stanza or each sloka, and then she would write her commentaries based on their questions. So it's a really interesting collaborative effort that was happening there. Okay, next, Jay. This one and the next slide are both just compilations of some quotes about the kind of editorial work that was being done by those who were working with her. So, for instance, the Keatleys, they say at the top that they're engaged in reading, rereading, copying, correcting, casting some of the sentences in English because they were literal translations from French. I mean, her English wasn't the best. She was fully admitted to her English not being the best. So she was always asking for help with their English. They were doing verification of quotations. They were also inserting their own quotations of Greek, Hebrew, and Sanskrit texts. So there's a lot of work that they were doing with it. Now, the bottom quote here is the one that I find the most hilarious, and it really exemplifies the struggle at the very end of the printing of The Secret Doctrine. They say, HPB read and corrected 2 sets of galley proofs. Now, we got a video coming up in a couple minutes. Going to tell you a little bit about what that means. Then a page proof, then finally a revise in sheet, correcting, adding, and altering up to the very last moment. And the result, a printer's bill for corrections alone over £300. Now, £300 in 1888 is £50,000 in today's dollars, to give some context for the amount of editing that she was doing at the last minute. Okay, next. Quotes here about the Keatleys and Mead. One of the interesting things is that, the Secret Doctrine was published before G.R.S. Mead got to headquarters and was living and working with HPB. And that's kind of a shame because he was an incredibly gifted editor. And from the moment he arrived, 1880, beginning of 1889, to the end of her life, everything she wrote, she gave to him the manuscript and he edited it. That includes the voice of the silence, as it says there in the second quote. That includes everything, all the Lucifer articles, some of our favorite articles, Psychic Noetic Action, these articles that were appearing in Lucifer in the last days. The routine was she would write it on a manuscript, hand it to Mead. Mead would do whatever he wanted to do with it and publish it. So he was very involved. Now, he wasn't there in 1888 to help with the Secret Doctrine. And that's a little bit of a shame because he probably would have helped with a lot of the minor corrections that needed to be made and the spelling and the English and all that stuff. So, okay, Jerry, next. Now, here's the sort of final quote that I want to go, and then we'll watch a short little video, take a little break. This is from James Price. Now, James Price was head of the HBB press, I believe. He was one of the ones who was in charge of publishing books in London for HBB at that time and after her death. Here's a quote from him. He says, "It was obvious to anyone familiar with the literary and mechanical details of book publishing that the manuscript of the SD had not been properly prepared for the printer, and that the proofreading had been so carelessly done, and that even glaring grammatical errors inadvertently made by the author had been allowed to stand." Now, the rest of that quote is in regards to the edition in 1893 that Mead put out, and Price is essentially defending that edition, saying, well, the editing that Mead did in 1893, that kind of editing actually should have happened before in 1888, before it was even published. So, what we have with the Secret Doctrine from 1888, the state of what was actually published is essentially what you would normally have for like a final draft before it goes back to everybody for like really further proofing, editing, all of that stuff. And it didn't get that treatment at that time in 1888. Now we're going to go pause for a second here from me talking and watch a little video to just give us a little taste of what printing was like back then for some context of the difficulty that was happening for HBB. Okay, go ahead, Jerry.
Each book begins in the Foundry, where Brian Ferret spends his day at a monotype machine from the 1890s making individual letters.
It can be very, very difficult. There could be days where nothing goes right. There could be weeks where nothing goes right. When I have 3 casters running and nothing's going wrong, that makes me just ridiculously happy.
He lights a fire under the machine, melting the lead, tin, and antimony solution that is used to create the letters.
We have a pump here and a nozzle, and the pump draws up the lead and then we'll shoot the lead out the nozzle.
From there, the lead goes into a mold. Then, a matte case with the chosen lettering pushes down on it. He sends the finished type down the hall to the print room.
By the end of the day, particularly when we're printing, we're covered with ink, and it's just fantastic. It's kind of like a good little kid again, getting messy and getting dirty. At this stage of the process, the Foundry has sent us galleys of type. They usually come out about 2 pages per galley. When we get those galleys, we take a proof print of that.
Jeff Raymond arranges the type into a page layout, letter by letter.
So on this one, this is page 53.
To keep the page together, Jeff wraps it in string. Then he brings it to the proofing press to check for any mistakes. Once the proof looks good, it goes for the final print run on one of the larger presses. The final stage of the bookmaking process is in the bindery.
This is where everything gets made into the book from scratch.
Megan Gibbous folds, sews, and glues each piece of the book together by hand. The final product is a work of art.
Okay, a little different than how we print books today. So you can imagine a galley proof being changed by HBB multiple times, how much work that would make for. So that gives a little bit of context for what it would have been like. I mean, there's also different printing methods, and that video is not exactly necessarily the exact method that was used, but it gives you good context for that. So this next slide here is just a little bit of a summary of sort of the editions of the Secret Doctrine that have come out. We have obviously the first edition from 1888, and then something that they called the second edition, but it was actually just a complete facsimile reprint of the first edition in 1889. And that's just because the original 500 copies in 1888 sold out before it was even on the press. So they had two printings. And then there's the edition 1893 by G.R.S. Mead, which is a revised edition. Right. In addition to that, you have the third volume that was published by Mead and Besant in 1897. And that sort of became the standard. At that time, that was the available printed edition of the Secret Doctrine. If you hadn't gotten yourself one of those early copies in 1888 or 1889, this 4-volume set would likely have been the set that you had. So it would have been Mead's volume 1 and 2, the volume 3 from Besant with an index. And that was a sort of 4-volume set. Now, those were used by everybody. I mean, even early ULT used those editions, and you find in early writings within ULT, within the Theosophy magazine and such, for example, references to the pagination of that 1893 edition rather than the 1888 edition. And so those were in circulation, they were being used. It wasn't until really the 1920s that the attitude towards those editions drastically changed. That's a whole history I'm not going to get into. It's well documented. People can look into it. But that changed, the attitude towards that changed among many theosophists. And in 1925 is when we see the Theosophy Company going back to facsimile editions. And that really changed the way that people related to the Secret Doctrine in the movement. So the tone that set, that the other organizations then followed is, we're going to go back to the 1888 edition. We're going to use that pagination. So all scholars and everybody started using that pagination. So that became the standard. Even when Boris de Zirkov did his version of the collected writings, which includes heavy editing, right? It's a very the collected writings series has a lot of editing in it, which is not a bad thing, but that's what it was. Even then, he decided, no, we have to stick to the original pagination. That's what we're doing now. So even his edition of the Secret Doctrine follows the same. Now we come to 2025, we look at that and we say, okay, well, we also have to stick to that, no matter what. So currently we're doing facsimile editions. Now we're gonna do something different, but we stick with the original 1888 edition as closely as possible. Okay, next, Jerry. So that brings us to where we are in 2025, 2026. And there's a whole history behind what we decided to do here. So we looked at what was needed to be done. And essentially, the Theosophy Company was printing the Secret Doctrine using plate facsimile technology. So photographic plate facsimiles. Now that is very hard to do these days, to find a printer who can do it. And so by necessity, the thing that you have to do is actually recast an entire book in a digital PDF that then can be sent to your printers. So you end up creating a verbatim edition rather than a facsimile edition. And that was the initial idea. The initial idea was just, we sit down, we reproduce the exact 1888 edition as a verbatim edition, and we print it. The thing that happens is you start going through that and you start realizing, okay, well, there's some mistakes in here. You go through the Secret Doctrine dialogues, for instance, HBB talks about some of the mistakes. She goes, there's this word here. That's not the word that was in my manuscript. The typesetter got it wrong. Can you fix that in the next edition? There's other things like just there's an E missing on the word the. Like you start seeing these little things and you're like, okay, we got to do that. Like, let's do that. Let's correct those ones that we know are incorrect. And the thing is that just keeps going. As you go through it, you start just seeing more and more where there are mistakes. Now, they're not mistakes in the philosophy. They're not mistakes in what HBB is teaching. They're grammatical mistakes. They're citation mistakes. They're, a single foreign term spelt 4 or 5 different ways in the same book. So, there's these kinds of things. You just start seeing these everywhere. You can go to the next slide. Jerry? So we start going through and we start thinking, okay, well, actually, we got to make these mistakes, make corrections to these mistakes. And the idea is essentially, when you're just reproducing a facsimile from plates, it just is what it is. You're not involved in the errors that are in there. The moment you move to reproducing a verbatim edition, where you're recreating a digital file that can be used for printing, now any mistakes that are in there are a conscious choice, right? Now if we leave a mistake in there, now we're saying, okay, we'll leave this mistake in. So it changes the dynamic a little bit in how we do it. So we started approaching it a little bit differently and saying, okay, well, actually what we want to do is do as minimally invasive editing as possible. So we want to catch the things that we know and we can verify and validate our mistakes, misspelled terms, wrong references, and so on, missing quotation marks, which was everywhere, misspelled foreign terms, like the Hebrew in the original Secret Doctrine is atrocious. So things like that, right? So we established a sort of, over time, we established a bit of a methodology of how we would go through those. And the guiding principle through all of that was like heavy restraint. Like we are not going to make a change of any kind unless it can be validated that is actually something that needs to be changed. And we're not going to do anything that alters the philosophy. We're not going to introduce any kind of change that says, no, HBB got it wrong here. So we don't do anything like that. It's all editorial, grammatical, it's all that kind of stuff. So the result that we end up with is, with our new edition, if you put it side by side with the old Secret Doctrine, which we'll do in just 1 second here, it is page for page, line for line identical. So every sentence on the page is identical as you go down. The first word, the last word. Pierre did all of that work, and I think it was something like 60 or 70,000 individual lines to be lined up exactly like the original in order to do that. So you can imagine the work that went into that. Jerry, go on to the next slide. So here's sort of what we have. So here's a good example. I wanted to use one that's kind of an interesting page. So here's page 5, right? So there's the original on the left, and there's the 2025 edition on the right. It's just a little bit cleaned up. We created a new font that is as close as we could to the original. We used, inside that font, we created symbols. So those symbols that appear aren't images in the new one. They're actually font glyphs. Go on to the next one, Jerry. Here's our favorite, well, my favorite. Page 200. There's the original, there's the new. It's just a little cleaner. It's just a little easier to read, a little easier to see. And not until you really look closely do you start seeing the changes. You know, there's a little spelling correction there. At the very top, third line down, there's a little page addition. You know, she says, here, look in volume 2 or in part 2. And we say, okay, well, that's actually page 590. Just a little helpful thing. Little tiny things like that you start to notice, but overall, it's the same book, which is what I was really happy when I got the printed edition in my hand for that. Okay, Jerry, go ahead. We'll just go through a few quick ones here. I just want to highlight a few things. Like these top 2 ones on here are really interesting because in the original manuscripts, they were numbering the commentaries on the stanzas 1, 2, 3, 4. Once they got into the printed edition, they started numbering them A, B, C, D. So some of the original references to number 1 or number 2 or whatever, they were left in place. So the second one down, so he says, see commentary number 1 to this stanza. Well, in the actual edition, it's commentary A to this stanza, not commentary 1. So you go looking for commentary 1, you're like, where's commentary 1? Right? So those kinds of things are the things that we focused on. In the third one down, you see a reference to the Vayu Purana. We've added the verse number. So you want to find it in the Vayu Purana, it's verse 417. The bottom 2 are references. So you can see the second from the bottom there, Vasilev on Buddhism, page 97 to 950. Well, that's incorrect. There's not 950 pages in that book. So we reformat the reference to be an official reference. It's got the title of the book, the year, the way you would normally do a citation, and we fix it up. Lots of that kind of stuff. Go ahead. Next, Jerry. An example, okay, the stanzas appear twice in the Secret Doctrine, right? They appear in summary form at the beginning, and then they appear again every time there's a commentary. And sometimes there's discrepancies between them. In most cases, we just leave those discrepancies. In some cases, it's so simple to just add a little thing in. So for instance, in the first edition, you see on page 31 in the top left, it's missing the, and then the circle. On page 98, in the original edition, it has it there, Svabhavat, the circle. right? So in our edition, we just restore it on page 31. So we have that in place there. Simple things like that. Go ahead next. Here's a great example. Okay, this quote appears twice in the Secret Doctrine. Okay, on page 19, and on page 542. If you look on the left, on the top, there's a spelling mistake. It says, or a grammatical mistake. It says, "and is the time last," instead of "and time is the last." We fix that, and then we also validate it. So the quote on the bottom, that's from Wilson's Vishnu Purana. That's where she quoted that from. So we can validate that's actually the correct quote. Let's fix that one. So we fix it in the new edition. This is sort of the process that we went through. So it's not changing philosophical things. It's just fixing up those things that actually in 1888, that's what should have happened. Okay, next. Here's one from HPB herself. So the bottom part here is a quote from her from the Secret Doctrine Dialogues. She says, "Radiant, it ought to be radiant, right? And it's put radical." She says, they have made of primordial matter something political." She had a great sense of humor. So in the original edition, radical was a typesetter's error. We fix it in the new edition to radiant according to HPB's instructions. So that's a good example. Okay, next. There is a hilarious one. A footnote that should have been on page 242 is actually on page 239. Now, I'm just going to leave this slide. People can look through it in detail later. But basically, on page 242, there's two identical footnote markers for one footnote because the other one accidentally got put on the wrong page. So we fix it and we put it on the right page. Go ahead, Jerry, next. So this is what it looks like. The before on 242, there's two footnote markers, one footnote. New, there's two footnote markers, two footnotes. So, it's simple, but you can see how they were scrambling when printing. And there you go, right? Okay, next and final one, I think. The Hebrew. The Hebrew is terrible. Absolutely terrible. Obviously, nobody knew how to read Hebrew. And they made a big mess of it. So all of the Hebrew on the left is wrong. And then the Hebrew on the right side is correct. Now, if anybody here speaks Hebrew, you will look on the left and you'll be like, what are those words? They're not words. They're not real words at all. So we've just made those corrections and fixed them up. They're all very obvious words. They're very easy to know what they ought to be, like Ein Sof, for instance, Galgalim, for instance, Adam Ilyaha, which is the same as Adam Kadmon. So we just fix all that up. So that's an example of what we've done. And we now have a new edition of the Secret Doctrine that is as close as we could possibly stick to the original 1888 edition with as minimally invasive editing as we possibly can. And we're very happy with it and very proud of what's out. I think it's a great edition. And lots of work went into it. Kudos to Pierre Wouters for 90% of that work. So, all right. And sorry for going a little overtime there.
No, that's perfect. Thank you so much, John. I look forward to looking at those slides. And we appreciate the work that you and Pierre have done in presenting the new version. It's beautiful. I cannot recommend it enough. It is definitely a work of art. And the corrections are helpful because as a young person, I remember reading some of those references and kind of going, well, I can't make sense of that. So I would just let it go. Because usually back in those days, to find a reference, you had to go to the library and look up an index card and then find the book. And it became almost impossible. So now with this, I can just sit with Google and find all these different references, and it's so helpful. So again, thank you, John, for your work. Yes.
Yes, I just wanted to thank those who have really, through great and immense labor, redone the mistakes that were in the Secret Doctrine, that they were essentially typographical errors and misplaced footnotes, etc., because I've had to deal with other academics who have tried to put down the Secret Doctrine because of these mistakes. which are really very trivial compared to the great message that is there, which HPB was really so humble in bringing to us. And what I also admire is that the men who did the great, immense work didn't put any redactions or interpolations in the Secret Doctrine, which others have done, I guess, to try to make it more popular or readable. And I can remember also a Jewish scholar who was immensely learned, that at one point he was actually putting down the way the Hebrew was written in a mistaken way in certain pages of the Secret Doctrine. On the other hand, he said the Kabbalah says that there were three different creations before our creation. Of course, he's affirming, the three rounds before our fourth round. So, I mean, without realizing it, he really was affirming the Secret Doctrine. So I think the work that's been done by those in Los Angeles and associates have been very important. And of course, we have to thank the original writer and other helpers of the Secret Doctrine who lived in the 19th century. But the fact that we have it is so important, and we want to read it for ourselves and not let anyone else interpret for us. I think that's so important, that you've got to do it by yourself and no one else can do it for you.
Well, that comes out in the history that we saw of the writing of the Secret Doctrine, that we see that it was such a collaborative effort, and how as students we must continue that same kind of collaboration and work in our efforts too, and not to dogmatize the Secret Doctrine, to make it hard and fast in our study, but actually to keep it a living, breathing document of our own journey, as Jean's letter to ourself stated. And so we have to continue to recognize that we have a responsibility to that self-effort. So thank you, Judy. Jerry.
Yeah, I wanted to underscore a couple things that were said just briefly. Number one, a fellow student years ago made this comment, and it's stuck in my mind ever since. He said, each individual has to create their own relationship with the Secret Doctrine, which I think underscores some things that Jean was saying. I mean, each human, it's the self-reliance idea that we get in Emerson, and the self-reliance idea that I think is pervasive in our literature and theosophy. This whole endeavor is to come in contact with the self within and to see it in each and every other person. And that's a very private enterprise. And so it's been interesting to me that even though so much of the Secret Doctrine seems impossible to understand, there always are things you run into, snippets, sentences, a passage, a page, a chapter that speaks to you. And when that speaks to you, then you have something to hold on to. It's like finding some gold in a river. So it's a little bit like when we study sacred texts of different kinds, you find passages that resonate with you, and that's what you're looking for. So that's just one comment. I just have to give a shout out to John.
Yeah.
I thought I knew the story of the Secret Doctrine. Today, I discovered I knew just 1/100th of the story. I couldn't think of any reason why that should be made it into a movie. It's so dramatic and so interesting and fascinating with so many twists and turns. John, your presentation was brilliant, and I think you could have gone on and on and on and not lost our interest. So kudos to you and all the people behind the scenes that put the work in. There was a wonderful amount of work done by others that we haven't mentioned. I know there was artwork, a lot of artwork that was done, a lot of care put into choosing the printer and the paper. and then just an enormous effort by a handful of people who probably don't want the praise that I'd love to give them, that literally thousands of hours of work. So, thank you.
And by the way, I just want to point out that John, in his talk on the Secret Doctrine, was actually stated a lie when he said that I did 90% of the work. No, 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 no. I would say probably somewhere more in 55, 45, and John had the 55 part, And I just felt like a monk for 5 years, 12 to 14 hours a day, putting down line by line and making sure that it fit. And I don't know if some of you see that in the Secret Doctrine. If you look at the first 289 pages, that's part one of the Secret Doctrine. Look at the spacing between the lines. It is actually quite broad. And I didn't notice it until I started doing that work. Once you turn to part two on page 303, all of a sudden, all the lines are compressed. So if the printer had continued the way he was doing, our Secret Doctrine would have been way over 2,000 pages. So it is also my impression that the work was not so much done by a printer, but rather it's almost like an apprentice was used. Like, here's the Secret Doctrine, and here's your test to learn how to set print. So those are little things that we have to keep in mind. And it was good that we showed that little video on how books were made in those times. That was a tremendous work. And when HPB decided to change something, everybody was pulling his hair out, of course, which they almost literally did.
Thank you. I think too, what the history of the writing of the Secret Doctrine shows us that the evolution and the process involved in it, and then maybe in a way then shows us that we have to be patient and persistent with our own process, with our own way of working with Theosophy as well. That that we shouldn't underestimate ourselves. I mean, when we see the end result there of the Secret Doctrine, there are some who think that all happens by magic. It just happens all at once. But then when you look at the history, you see that there were hundreds and hundreds of pages abandoned, forgotten, not used, changed, And so it helps us to honor our own process as well, and maybe continue on with the work. John?
All right. Yeah. And just along that line, one of the things that's really fascinating when you read a bunch of letters and such from HPB when she's talking about writing the Secret Doctrine, or when she's writing to somebody asking for help or things like that, is just how humble she was about her own knowledge in trying to put it together. There's so much there where you can really feel for her that she was given this monumental task. There's a letter where she's expressing that, like, she says, if I could take Isis' unveil and hurl it to the eighth sphere, I would. She wanted nothing to do with any of it anymore. But she's like, but it's not up to me. Master asked to do it. I do it. And so, there's this exemplification of work that she gives, which is also, we can easily have this perspective of like HPB is just like so incredibly broadly knowledgeable and all of this stuff, and yes, true in a way, and also she was kind of like just barely not drowning the whole time she was writing the Secret Doctrine, because what she was trying to do was such a monumental task. And I feel like we can take good inspiration from that, because I know for myself and for many I've talked to in the Theosophical movement, sometimes we think like, who am I to write an article? Or like, I don't know it well enough to speak up in class, or I don't, like these kinds of things. But like, take the inspiration from her in what she did, that we can all accomplish something. We all have something that we can bring to the table. And we can, right? Like, Gene, your talk today was amazing, and and Wes as well. Like we all have something to say, you know.
Yeah.
We don't have to be an HPB, but we all have something, and we can be humble like she was, and we can offer what we have to offer. And that, I think, is how it keeps us, you know, as a movement, keeps us going. It's never been a movement of one person, you know. It's a collective. Yeah.
I think that's very important. That's never been a movement of one person. Beautifully said. And I can relate to her about the wanting to throw out the ISIS Unveiled. So many talks that I've given that I wish I could have thrown them out too. You know, you abandon the talk as soon as it's done. You think, oh my goodness, that does not begin to say what we intended to say. So yeah, we have that as well.
I just want to give a quick shout out to all the people also that helped proofreading the Secret Doctrine. So just a quick shout out to 3 or 4 people that really helped out with proofreading. Thank you.